Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk about the passing of a very influential figure, a a polarizing figure in American politics, former Vice President Dick Cheney, who passed away at the age of uh, was he 91, I believe. Yeah, 91. I mean, excuse me, 84 years old. Sorry, 84 years old. Um, yeah, Yeah, Dick Cheney was a controversial figure in American politics because to many he was the architect of the Iraq War. He started his career in politics in the 1960s. In the early 1960s, he got a master's degree in political science at the University of Wyoming, and he started his career in politics under Wisconsin uh, Congressman William Steiger. From there, he served as the deputy chief of staff in the 1970s, from 1975 onward, as deputy chief of staff of President under President Gerald Ford. He was part of the so-called, what they call in American political history, the Halloween massacre, which was basically a clearing out or a mass firing of various people within President Ford's cabinet. Because you got to remember, President Gerald Ford was at that time a very unpopular president because he was not the only president in U.S. history that was never elected, right? He got into office after the Watergate scandal and he pardoned Richard Nixon, right? So from here, Cheney climbs up the ladder, the Republican ladder, as it were, in Republican politics. He then goes on to serve under Ronald Reagan's administration. And it is under Ronald Reagan's administration that he does some things that are questionable in terms of foreign policy. One of which is um, he opposed sanctions against the government of South Africa in the 1980s. People were pressuring President Reagan to put economic sanctions on South Africa for its treatment of its black citizens. You know, they were under apartheid. Cheney opposed that because he said they almost never work and they make life worse for the populace. Another thing he opposed this time in the 80s that was a huge issue was the uh, you know, making Martin Luther King's birthday a federal holiday. And Cheney opposed that that as well. Later, he changed his vote, but initially he opposed it, like many Republican senators did at the time, especially like Jesse Helms and all those. They say nowadays you hear mainstream Republicans or mainstream conservatives say that they liked Martin Luther King Jr. That they try to say retroactively that he was a Republican. He was not a Republican. He didn't support any party, really. Um, but they retroactively say they would have agreed with him were he alive. Well, he was already dead in the 80s when they were opposing making his birthday an official holiday. So, I mean, what does that tell you? From there, he was the Secretary of Defense under President George H.W. Bush. So that's already four Republican administrations that he played a key role in. And he was responsible for the 1989 invasion of Panama to topple Manuel Noriega, as well as Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. He negotiated with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia at the time to allow U.S. troops onto the base, to establish bases there when fighting the war against Saddam Hussein. This was, of course, the one of the main incidents, besides America's unilateral support of Israel, one of the main incidents that triggered Osama bin Laden anger. Osama bin Laden's anger toward the United States was the fact that Saudi Arabia allowed non-Muslims, kuffar, non-Muslim army in the United States to have stations, there. This of course triggered bin Laden. This was in 1991, right? Operation Desert Storm and Operation Desert Shield. Cheney was behind that. And then in 2000, as the son was running for president, he approached Dick Cheney to be his running mate. So in 2000, despite the controversy surrounding the election of President Bush and, Governor Bush at that time was governor of Texas, and Vice President Al Gore, they won the election. You know how it went down, the 2000 election. They won the election, and Dick Cheney became the Vice President of the United States. Now, Dick Cheney's extensive history with regard to foreign policy, with regards to, especially in the Middle East, was going to serve President Bush pretty well, he thought, because Cheney, knew all the movers and shakers. He worked well with the Israelis. He worked well with the Saudis and the Turks and people that were our historic allies in the Middle East, the Gulf countries, especially Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, etc. Right? So 9/11 happens. And then that's when Cheney advises George Bush to persuade the world that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. This is perfectly played out in a movie called Vice, starring Tyler Perry, which is basically about Dick Cheney. Convince the world that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction so we can basically finish what we started in the Gulf War, in the Persian Gulf in the 90s. Which was to get rid of the regime of Saddam Hussein. We stopped him from invading Kuwait in the 90s, but he remained in power throughout that time. But now, Cheney, we needed a reason to go into Iraq. So Cheney, Bush, and Secretary of State at that time, Colin Powell, decided to go towards the world trying to prove their case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and they were collaborating with terrorists. This was something that Dick Cheney and the neocons believed, right? That after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, this gentleman over here is talking about the Bible and the end of European civilization. Well, it was definitely the end of civilization with regards to the Soviet Union in 1991 with their collapsing. They were the main adversary. The entire apparatus of all conservatives, conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats from 1945, the end of World War II, to 1991 was to stop the Soviet Union, right? Every administration was to stop the Soviet Union. Now the Soviet Union no longer existed. Russia existed as a federation, and a bunch of other their other satellite states in the Warsaw Pact were now independent countries, and places in Central Asia also were independent countries. But now Cheney wanted to zero in. We talked about it on September the 11th, 1991. George Bush, who was the president at that time, George Bush Sr., who was the president at that time, makes the speech about a new world order, taking a page out of Woodrow Wilson's book. Woodrow Wilson in 1915 talked about a new world order. But Bush, what he meant by a new world order was the post-Soviet world. So people like Cheney wanted to zero in on other threats: North Korea, Iraq, and Iran. So they figured they'd take out Iraq first. They used 9/11 as the cause. Oh, well, Saddam is collaborating with terrorists, with the Islamist terrorists, which, if you knew anything about the geopolitics of the Islamic world, was not even remotely true, because Saddam was secular, right? Islamists were suppressed in Saddam's Iraq, right? He wasn't going to allow religious extremism in Iraq, but hey, they had the American people convinced, and we went to war under those false pretenses. So many people dislike Dick Cheney for that, specifically for that, because the Iraq war, nothing was accomplished there. If anything, we made the situation worse for many people, for Shias, for Kurds, for Sunnis that live in Shia areas, because we didn't realize how divided and how bifurcated Iraq really was. Iraq has many different ethnicities and many different religions. You have the Shia Muslims, which they form the majority. Then you have the Sunni Muslims in the north. And then, of course, you have the Kurds. So when Saddam was a vicious dictator, right? He was the glue holding it together. He was persecuting Kurds and Shias. But once he was removed from power, the puppet government that we put in power in Iraq wasn't strong enough to hold all these parties together. And what ended up happening first, what we tried to say was the reason why we invaded in the first place, that there were Islamic extremists in Iraq, later arrived on Iraq's doorstep. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. We said there were Islamic extremists in Iraq. There weren't. But once we got in there, the insurgents, there were old Ba'athist, Ba'athist party members. Ba'ath Party is a pan-Arabist party founded by a Lebanese Christian gentleman named Michael Aflaq. In the 20th century, Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad's father in Syria belonged to this. Saddam Hussein belonged to this. And I think even former Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser also belonged to it. They were secularists. But the people who served under Saddam, they later became Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda spread to Iraq, and later Iraq became one of the two countries that became the basis for ISIS. So the formation of ISIS and the spread of ISIS by Musab al-Sarkawi, right? So Dick Cheney basically made the situation worse in Iraq, and Iraq has been giving trouble with us ever since, because that's the problem. We think that the Middle East thinks like us. We think that the Middle East is westernized. We think that we can export democracy to the Middle East. But each and every time that we try to do that, it always backfires on us, because we misunderstand the culture of the people. We misunderstand how they view the world, right? Much older cultures than our own. Iraqi society goes all the way back to the beginning of civilization, to Sumer and to the city-state of Sumer, right? To the Akkadians, to the Babylonians, right? and to the classical Islamic age of the Abbasid Empire. So these civilizations are older than us, and we thought we can impose our way of life on them. Now, some would say that Cheney had, uh, ulterior motives. He was working with Blackwater. He had people on the board of Enron, and that was the reason why he did what he did, why he encouraged us to invade Iraq, so that he and his business partners could do business in Iraq. And maybe that was the reason, but he caused tremendous misery to the American people, to families in the military, and to people globally when it came to the Iraq War, a war that was, I think, nowadays, in 2025, we can agree that the Iraq War was a mistake. Afghanistan obviously wasn't. It was. We shouldn't have stayed as long as we did, especially after we caught Osama bin Laden, but it was necessary because they were harboring Osama bin Laden and they were an Islamist regime. Iraq wasn't an Islamist regime. Saddam Hussein was a vicious bastard, but he kept the country together. He kept the country united under the reign of fear, under the reign of fascism. But, he kept it united nonetheless. So removing him was a mistake. And lying about it to the American people that he had weapons of mass destruction 2 years after we were hit um, in the Twin Towers was an equally bad decision. And we still haven't gotten Iran and North Korea. We still haven't encouraged regime change in there. So Cheney's legacy still lives on in some people in the Trump administration. But anyway, and a funny thing about Dick Cheney, he was hunting one time and he shot his own friend. So he was a horrible shot. But anyway, rest in peace to Dick Cheney. Condolences to his family, but I say he's still a very divisive figure when it comes to American politics. His way of doing business, invade everybody that we don't agree with, that has a different ideology than us, is stupid. We think things go well because we had a successful, our occupation of Japan after World War II was successful. But Japanese culture is very different than Middle Eastern culture, right? You can't just occupy a Middle Eastern country and expect that Middle Eastern country is going to adapt to Western lifestyle. And if they do, they're going to have to do it with brute force and dictatorships, and a dictatorship in the way like the Shah of Iran did before Khomeini's revolution, or how Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, did when he dissolved the Ottoman Empire in the early 1920s. So I think, they were expansionists. Like I said, Blackwater, Enron, and things like that Cheney was involved with may have been his real reason. But whatever his reason, whether it was bringing democracy to the Middle East or whatever, it ended up being a disaster. Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Peace.